Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Goprogman Taylor, and this is episode 34, F# and Giraffe with Stuart Lang. In this episode I interviewed Stuart about F#, Giraffe, the safe stack, and whether you should contemplate using a functional paradigm for your web development. Some of you may know Stuart from his work on his website at stew.dev, or the events DDD Southwest, F# Bristol, and .NET Southwest, all of which he helps to run. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So thank you ever so much for being on the podcast, Stuart. I realize that, everyone has got so much going on in their lives that taking, some time out to talk to me and the listeners about some stuff is, it's not always the easiest thing to do. And I completely appreciate that.
No, thanks for having me on. I very much appreciate being on the show.
Oh, fantastic. You're very welcome. Very welcome. I always like to hear from as many people in the community as possible because, we're about to talk about something today that I have no idea, Previously, when I've talked to people, it's been, I have an idea what Xamarin is, and I know what ASP.NET Core is, and I know what the middleware pipeline is, but I have almost no idea when it comes to F#, functional programming, or Giraffe, or any of these things. So,
excellent.
So you're going to be my expert today.
Cool.
Excellent. Okay. So I just thought before we sort of start, I was wondering, could you sort of introduce yourself to the listeners so that we know, a little bit about you and what you're all about?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Stuart Lang. I'm a .NET developer based in the southwest of England. And I speak at events usually about something C# or F# related. And I'm also one of the organizers for a community event, DDD Southwest. And also help to organise a couple of meetups in Bristol, which is .NET Southwest and F# Bristol.
Fantastic. There's a lot of stuff going on there. I could totally appreciate how busy that must be. I've only ever sort of partially attended meetups and a couple of DDD North events, and the sheer amount of work that goes into organising those things, it's beyond my comprehension. So, yeah, I really appreciate that potentially takes up a lot of your time.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like on the DD Southwest front, I owe it to the community because it was at that event that I kind of got my previous job. So this is just me sort of paying it back. So I've got so much out of Andy's podcast as well. So anywhere I can sort of pay it back by doing my bit,
I like it. It's ever so important to sort of pay back to the community and attempt to sort of help the people who are maybe just coming into the community to sort of get them up to speed or give them any kind of helping hand. But, I totally agree with you on that one. It's very important to do that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So we're going to talk about F# and a little bit about Giraffe. I kind of hinted at them earlier on, but like I said earlier on, I have no idea when it comes to F# and functional programming. I know that there are monads and that nobody knows what they are. And I know that, is it functional programming where you can't affect the global state or you can't affect the state of variables and things like that? But that's about the extent of my knowledge.
Yeah, there's a bit of a running joke with the whole monad thing, and I won't try and explain it because, in honesty, I don't fully understand it. But F# is quite a pragmatic programming language in that there's different paradigms. So you can still do, imperative programming and object-oriented programming, but it's more focused on functional. But you don't have to know all the sort of academic things about monads and all that sort of thing to kind of get going with it.
Okay. So I can have, say, I guess it would work similarly to C#. I guess the syntax is a little different, but I have an object, I call a function, I get a response.
Exactly, yeah. So I think a lot of people have that misconception. They think that F# is possibly something like Haskell or something where it's in a different kind of space, but really it is just like C# in the sense that it's multi-paradigmed. So nothing stops you implementing interfaces, and sometimes, for example, if you're giving people a library, actually having interfaces and having classes which are just a bit more easier to iterate on in terms of an API surface, sometimes that makes sense. But the wonderful thing is you don't have to. You can use whatever makes sense. You can use a functional style, or you can use an object-oriented style if you need to.
Okay, so there's a possibility that I could be using or consuming a functional library and I just don't realize because it's hidden behind an interface inside of a NuGet package, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple ways, just to explain as well, you can actually just have a mixed solution where you have C# projects sat alongside of F# projects. And yeah, you might have, and some people do it two ways. You can have a C# project that's a very thin wrapper around your F# core code, or you can kind of write your F# in a way that's exposed in a more C# friendly way. And you can kind of do it either way. The way you'd know is if you look at the dependencies in your NuGet package, you'll probably have a dependency on F#.core, but that would be pretty much it. It would, from consuming it, and there are libraries out there of which I can't think off the top of my head, but there are libraries out there that are written in F# but consumed in C#.
Okay. I think that's one of the beauties, I guess, of the base class libraries, as they were called in .NET Framework, the sort of a common language runtime, is that you can have multi-language projects and solutions. I guess solutions rather than projects. I remember at the time there was a lot of C# and VB together, but I guess the lingua franca now would be C# and F#.
Yeah. And sometimes I wish you could just to make it a little bit, easier, just in the project, being able to just mix in C# and F# files. But yeah, no, you can certainly mix solutions together for sure.
Well, maybe that's the future. Maybe some boffin at Microsoft will come up with a way of combining it all together and we'll be good to go.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about F# and functional programming and how you don't really need to know that much about functional programming really to use F#. But we said that we were going to talk about Giraffe as well. So I was wondering, could you give us a brief overview of what Giraffe is?
Yeah, sure. So today, if you were to create a .NET Core application, or an ASP.NET Core application, I should say. So if you just say .NET New and look at all the templates, you'll see that you have the F# templates there. So F# comes out the box with .NET Core SDK. And you've got options there for like ASP.NET Core MVC, for example. So if you say .NET New -- Lang F# MVC, you'll get a new MVC application all written in F#. And that's great. But it would be a shame to want to build a web application and not take advantage of all the things that F# offers. And so that's where there are web frameworks built in F# for F#. And that's where those fit in. So that's what Giraffe is. Giraffe is an open source web application framework, and it sits on top of ASP.NET Core, very much like MVC does. And it has a different composition model, which it borrows from Suave, which is another F# web framework. And it's really quite nice. So if I would describe how a Giraffe application works, you can compose your application out of these things called HTTP handlers, and you sort of compose them all together. And a HTTP handler is effectively the way to sell it to a C# developer is it's sort of ASP.NET Core middleware on steroids. So it's very similar if you look at the signature of an ASP.NET Core middleware, and it only varies in a subtle way. That means that when you compose them together, rather than with middleware, you can only compose them in one big sort of line. You can only say, invoke this one and then the next and then the next. You kind of have this singular pipeline. In Giraffe, the handlers themselves can signal whether they succeeded or aborted. And that way you can compose them in more interesting ways. You can say, if this one succeeded, then do this next thing. For example, if the user is authenticated, then show the admin-only web page. But you can break it down even further than that. You can have a handler just to check if it's a GET request. You have a handler to check that it's for a certain route within your application. And then you can also combine these handlers and say, if this route doesn't succeed and it aborts, then try the next one. So you've got this really kind of powerful way of expressing an application by putting together what effectively are very high-performing, lightweight HTTP middlewares, but with a really sort of expressive model, if that makes sense. It's hard to see without code on the screen, but yeah, that's kind of in essence what Giraffe is.
Okay, yeah, I get the idea. Yeah, in my head, I have like maybe a finite state machine design, and each one of the nodes, I guess, could be one of the HTTP handlers. And a request comes in. Is it valid for this one? Nope. Okay. Is it valid for that one? Yes. But now that we've done that, let's do some other function. Maybe take the request and send it over to that HTTP handler as well. And then when that's done, if that fails, right, no, we can't do that. So let's go over in a different direction.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really nice as well is that the signature for the handler is so, it's relatively simple and it's very easy to write. So it's just coding against HTTP context, which, most ASP.NET Core developers know quite well already. So it's very easy just to, use the context and do things like look at headers, add headers, and just kind of reuse the knowledge you already know. And what's really nice as well is this Giraffe plugs in as, itself as a HTTP middleware. So everything else in the ASP.NET Core ecosystem you can still take advantage of. So the team I'm in at the moment, we have Identity Server, and we can plug in all the authentication middlewares like you would in an MVC application. We can take advantage of all that stuff, but still write everything and compose everything in the way we like with F#.
Oh, I like that. I like that, being able to sort of mix and match, I guess. There's this part of maybe MVC that I would like to be able to do something in my app, but I also want to use Giraffe to handle all of the HTTP handlers. I like that.
Another area where it's quite nice is that because it's just like ASP.NET Core middleware, it actually does really well in the benchmarks. So it performs just like middleware. When you've got MVC in the mix, it's doing a little bit more under the hood. So when you look at the Tech and Power benchmarks, Giraffe comes out on top of MVC, which is quite impressive. And it'll be exciting to see when ASP.NET Core 3 comes along. There's some massive performance gains that have been put in there in the last few months. And it should, everybody, including Giraffe, will get the benefit of that. So it'll be good to see.
I like that too, when the sort of base system gets improved and you can leverage that in whatever your apps are. I really like when that happens.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned a few things there. You talked about Suave and how that's, I guess, another F# based. I don't want to say MVC because I don't think it uses MVC, does it?
No, it's just so Suave is it was an existing. So it's actually. It's a web framework and a server. So the history behind it is the guy who initially built Giraffe, it's called Dustin Morris, and he built an extension to Suave that allowed it to be served on top of ASP.NET Core. And he then realized that actually there's an opportunity to make a whole new framework that kind of borrows the best bits from both worlds and takes the kind of the composition model that's really nice in Suave, but use all the fantastic engineering of the ASP.NET Core team have done in ASP.NET Core, and kind of fuse those two worlds together.
Okay, I like that. Taking like we said earlier on, taking the best of both worlds and sort of gluing it together and making a better product.
Yeah.
You mentioned off stream when we were sort of communicating beforehand that there's this thing called SAFE. I was wondering, could you talk about that and what the acronym means?
So there's a stack called Safe Stack. So this is like a web, I guess it's a web stack acronym. So there's LAMP stack, which is like, let's see if I can remember these. Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, and you've got mean stack for Mongo and Node and whatever else. There's out of the F# sort of ecosystem has emerged this Safe Stack. So I'll start confusingly with the A, which is for Azure, although you can deploy to other clouds. So that's really about the tooling that comes with the Safe Stack. So I should say it comes. You can install it as a .NET Core template as well, and you can kind of pick and choose the bits you want. But by default, you'll get it will deploy to Azure, and the F part stands for a project called Fable, and this is a F# to JavaScript transpiler, and it's called Fable because it basically uses Babel, and it uses the F# compiler services to take your F# code and take the sort of typed abstract syntax tree and translate it into the syntax tree that Babel uses. So then Babel actually is the thing that writes out the JavaScript. And so Fable means that you can write F# code and have it transpiled to JavaScript. So you can have code on the server with .NET Core that also you can share that code for client side. So you can have your models, for example, being shared. The E part of Safe stands for Elmish, which is kind of built on top of Fable because it's kind of, you write your code in F#, but again, it runs in the browser. So Elmish it comes from this architecture that was made popular by Elm, which is a client-side web framework. And Elm made popular this more and more up-and-coming trend of this UI architecture of model view update. And the idea with this is you have your model, which is basically the kind of state of your UI. You have an update function that takes a model and takes a message, which could be dispatched by the user doing some action. So you can think of it as an event. Maybe the user clicked on something, so it takes the model and it takes this message and it produces a new model. So it's a very functional style of programming in that you're not mutating anything. You're creating a new model each time. And finally, you've got the V part of it, which stands for view, and that just takes the model and turns it into a view. And depending on what sort of application model you're building for, whether it's in this case it's for the web. So what the framework will do for you is it will have some sort of virtual DOM implementation. So in Elmish, if you take the model and you map it to a view, it will use a virtual DOM to figure out what the diff is and do that in an efficient way. And under the hood, it uses React for that. This is also made recently popular by another F# library called Fabulous, which is a Xamarin Forms library. And it does the same thing. And basically, when you get to the view part, you kind of map it to this virtual, I won't say virtual DOM, but it's kind of, it looks a lot like the XAML markup of Xamarin Forms. And it will, under the hood, figure out what the diff needs to be, and it will make the changes for you under the hood, kind of abstract away from that. And you get this really nice sort of functional model. And it's interesting to see that I think Apple at their recent developer conference showed Swift UI, which seems like it's going down a similar style of a kind of a declarative UI and a more sort of functional UI kind of paradigm. And so that's Elmish. So you've got AFE, and the S at the front stands for a web framework called Saturn. And Saturn is basically another framework on top of Giraffe. So Giraffe kind of makes ASP.NET Core a bit more usable for F# users. Saturn sort of adds a layer on top of that in terms of it's a little bit more opinionated, it's a bit more structured. It gives you a bit more out of the box. But I personally haven't had much experience using Saturn. I know people like it. There's differences, but in my experience, I've primarily used Giraffe. But when you create the safe stack template, you can kind of pick and choose what you want. If you don't want to use, Azure, for example, you have to pick between Saturn and Giraffe. So you can kind of pick what you want. And it's a really nice framework. It was on the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar. So it was under their Assess ring a few months back now. So it's quite impressive. It has commercial support as well. So I think they're called Compositional IT offer commercial support for it. So it's not a sort of play thing. It's a really mature stack. You can kind of build really rich applications completely in F# end to end. It's really quite nice.
You were saying that you could take that safe stack using the template and sort of swap parts out.
Yeah. So when you do, .NET New, and after you've installed the template and you pick the safe stack template, I forget the name of it, but yeah, it has a little wizard where it's like, oh, would you like to use Saturn or Giraffe? And it asks you a few other questions, and it just, so you can take your pick.
I see. So I could end up with, I'm just trying to work out the acronym now. So I could just buying a little time. So you could end up with a GAFE, I guess? GAFE.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Christoph, who's the guy who built Saturn, he knew what he was doing because Before it was Satin, it was Suave, but for reasons, they decided they wanted to take a different framework. So he deliberately created it with a name starting with the letter S. But yeah, you could pick Giraffe and it wouldn't sound quite as good.
I mean, we all know that naming things in development is hard, right? So why not start with something you already know?
Yeah.
I have heard of MVU and Elmish before, but only in the context of Fabulous. So it was nice to get a slightly clearer description of what Elmish and MVU architecture are, because, like I say, they've been sort of mentioned to me in passing. So it's nice to know that it comes from Elm and exactly the idea behind MVU, because I haven't had a chance to try it, but I think I might see if I can create something that uses the MVU architecture. Have you heard about Rider, a cross-platform .NET IDE developed by JetBrains and based on IntelliJ Platform and ReSharper? If not, it's time to give it a try. Develop .NET, ASP.NET, .NET Core, Xamarin, or Unity applications on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Get Rider today at rideride.net and try it for free for 30 days. That's rideride.net. I'm interested about the Fable aspect. So I create my F# code to run on the server, and I have some kind of view model perhaps, and I could just, during that build process, the stack knows magically that, or maybe not magically, but the stack knows somehow that this particular F# model needs to be converted to JavaScript, or do I need to say these models are JavaScript and will run on the client, or am I mistaking what's happening there?
So on the client side, there's certain code you can't run, to be clear. So you can't just from your F# reference any arbitrary .NET DLL. So it works at a language level. So it will take the F# code and it will see when you're calling things from F#.core, things like, all the primitive types, things like datetime, and the Fable team have re-implemented in JavaScript all of the sort of F# functionality you find just using kind of out-of-the-box F# code. There's other libraries, like, for example, I think BigInt or Big Integer, that's been, there's bits that people kind of commonly use that they've re-implemented, but you can't just go and grab some arbitrary DLL. There are libraries out there that are deliberately written so that they work in both full framework or .NET Core and Fable. For example, there's a serialization library, I forget the name of it, but it means that you can kind of use it in either setting and it will just work. You want to use it for composing your application and for dealing with view models and things like serialization, HTTP calls. That's kind of as far as it goes to some degree. You can kind of, if you call something in a third-party library and you do want to kind of say, you want to get into the sort of Fable transpilation and say, when you encounter this function, this method, rewrite it into this JavaScript. You can do that, but generally, you're kind of moving out of the sweet spot of where that tool works.
That makes sense. I like that, though, that you can almost automatically have part of your code transpiled to JavaScript, because that's the bane of, at least from my point of view, if I'm doing something C# on the back end and JavaScript at the front end, keeping those view models in sync is always a pain.
Yeah. And there are tools to do that and stuff. And it'll be interesting with Blazor and seeing how that changes things up. But from my understanding at the moment is that Blazor will kind of add a burden in terms of how much you're sending assemblies down over the wire and this kind of thing. So there still is room for this sort of thing where you are delivering JavaScript that's been transpiled, be it by something like TypeScript or some other thing, for example F#. And the MVU architecture is actually a really nice pattern and quite addictive once you got to grips with it and got into that, got into the pattern of adapting it. It's really quite nice, and it's quite an addictive paradigm, and it's hard to move away from. It's very testable as well. So something I didn't mention is that because it's very functional, the update function, for example, it's a pure function. It doesn't touch anything else. It takes in a model and a message, and it gives you another model. So a lot of unit testing when you're doing the object-oriented code is getting classes into the right state to be able to exercise the right code in the right way. But here you've got something where you just hand it the model in its the original state, and then check the output once you've put it through your update function. So that's really, really nice. And a lot of these frameworks as well allow you to test at the virtual DOM layer that they implement. So the same is true for Fable. You can there's in the samples, you can see how you can test it in a more thicker, just under the surface kind of way, which you sort of miss out on, I think, when you don't use this paradigm.
It's something you've said there I really like, that you don't have to get, like you said, get your C# objects into the right state to begin with, because with MVU, you're just literally saying, hey, model, here's the update function, give me the model back. I like that.
Yeah.
You see, that was going to be one of my questions about the safe stack. If you swapped Saturn for Giraffe and Fable for Blazor, you would get the Gabe stack.
That would work. Yeah, I consider it being quite nice. I actually have a little project that I'm working on that I haven't done anything with, that is using Blazor with F#, and it's using Giraffe. So that would be a Gabe stack if I host it in Azure. So there you go. Yeah, there we are.
Yeah, because I was going to ask whether Blazor worked with that. Because I mean, you said earlier on how Giraffe allows you to just take the bits from ASP.NET Core MVC if you need them, and I guess Blazor is now part of ASP.NET, so you could just hook it up, do whatever wizardry you need to. Like I say, F# is not my forte, so you do whatever it is you need to do to bring in Blazor, and then it just runs on the front end, I guess.
Yeah, and so the team, that ASP.NET Core team that are working on Blazor, there's nothing in there that inherently doesn't work with F#, but I think there's some effort that has to go in just to make it consumable. But there's a library out there, I can't remember the name of it, that kind of does that and kind of makes it accessible to you in F#, and it works fantastically. So yeah, it's exciting times, definitely, for a .NET developer, C# or F#,
Definitely. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about building some applications to deal with audio in the browser, and we said, hey, why don't you just use WebAssembly and pull in a well-known C library for doing all of that stuff and just build a wrapper around it.
Yeah, that's a crazy thing, and that would absolutely work. So yeah, it's when you think of the possibilities, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is, considering you can get almost anything to WebAssembly transpilers now.
Yes, yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was a rock starter to WebAssembly.
Love that, yeah.
So from what you've said so far, it makes sense to me that maybe a functional viewpoint, or maybe using Giraffe, fits really well with WebDev. At least WebDev. I don't know about functional with everything else because I've never really talked about it. But for you, is it a good fit? Is it something that you like? If somebody says to you, you can use whatever technology you want, are you torn between C# and ASP MVC versus F# and Giraffe, or are you happy to just go, we'll mix and match, we'll do this and pull this thing in, and how does that fit with you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, F# feels like a really good fit for the web in particular, because the web is inherently functional. When you think of HTTP, you've got a request and a response. That's naturally a function, and that's kind of how ASP.NET Core models it. So it is all very functional. So that kind of, for me, it's a kind of a no-brainer for the web side of things. But in the other spaces, what's really fascinated me is I would never have thought that for UI architecture, functional pattern or functional architecture would make any sense. But it turns out with what Elm's proved, and then from Elm, React, and now everyone's jumping on it, that this sort of model view update pattern is really a really nice fit, and no one, I don't think anyone really saw it coming, that the sort of functional UI architecture would work so well. But definitely for the web, I would say I've given talks on this before, and some people take a sort of, from the C# a defensive viewpoint of, so are you telling me to rewrite my code and rewrite everything in F#? And I'm like, absolutely not. Like, I'm just enthusiastic about it, and I hope I can rub my enthusiasm off on people. Really forcing sort of these sorts of technical language change top down, within your team just won't work. You need to build your applications and whatever your team is excited about. I would say that, so the team I've joined, the website that's built is built in Giraffe, And it was built by two developers who predominantly, they were Java developers, and they'd never touched .NET before, they'd never touched ASP.NET before, and they never touched F# before. And with minimal guidance, they've done a fantastic job, and they've just made it work. And it's not a trivial site either. It's talking to a headless CMS, and putting in, doing caching and putting in security headers and all the sort of gnarly real world stuff. And they just got on with it. And so often this is another thing people say is, I don't want to make it harder to find developers. I have a hard enough time as it is finding C# developers. But I think more and more today, it's more of a case that you're just looking for good developers, and it's less and less about, I need a language X developer.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the big things that sort of unifies. I know we mentioned .NET and MVC and all that kind of stuff, and Giraffe and all of these things together, but I think one of the things that's going to happen over the next year or so, when everything is unified to being .NET rather than there being a .NET framework, a .NET Core, a Mono, a Xamarin, and all of these hundreds of different things, when they are unified to .NET, that's one of the steps that we can take to simplify everything. Like you say, you won't have to say, I need a developer with this language or with this technology. It will just be I want a developer who can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really happy to see them make that announcement, actually. A little bit of me was sad because it's really nice to be able to search for .NET Core, and your show's .NET Core, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah. So it has a knock-on effect to the whole ecosystem, but I think it's an important message, because right before the announcement, it kind of felt like Microsoft had kind of almost abandoned the customers that would, I say stuck with full framework. I know that really it's mostly a marketing thing, and it's just .NET Core, but with enough functionality that they can stand up and say, this is something you should move to from .NET. But I think it's an important one. I think a lot of large enterprises were holding off, and I think this is really the sign to say, no, this is it now. This is the way forward.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Like you say, for big enterprises where your work rate is a little less speedy, your cadence of putting out new features isn't as fast, because maybe your IT department has to support older devices with older operating systems, and these are perhaps companies where they have a policy of, okay, IT installs the Windows updates and checks the network to make sure everything's still running nicely, and then they'll roll it out to everyone else. And a lot of the places where I've worked as a developer, the development team have been admins throughout the system, which is not great. But, in enterprise, you can't do that. And it makes sense that Microsoft are maybe signaling to the big enterprises, now is the time. Don't worry about it too much, and we'll sort of help you with the transition over. And I guess it makes it easier for looking for experts. Like I said earlier on about, you don't have to advertise for a .NET Core developer or a .NET Framework developer. You just advertise for a .NET developer.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
I think we already covered this, but I'm going to ask anyway.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, what are some of the maybe benefits and pitfalls of using F# over C# in that sort of web dev space? Or are there any? I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think if you're bought into F# and you decide that's what you want to do, and one of the big compelling reasons to use F# is for domain modeling and the kind of correctness it gives you there, and the kind of everything around that. And there's a fantastic book by Scott Voloshin called Making Domain Modeling Functional that really sells this really well, and it uses F# code throughout, and probably the best advertisement for building application F#. But if you're bought into, I'm going to use F#, that's when you're going to want to say, I want to build my web application with it, not just your domain model. But there's nothing wrong with C#. I mean, I love C#. I'm quite excited by the new features that are coming. So I don't see them as replacements, and I want to say I don't see them as competing, but they are a bit, in my heart for sure. But yeah.
Okay, so would you agree it's fair to say that it's just a case of it's another tool in your tool belt, I guess, another way of solving whatever problem? It could be that, some of the code that I'm working on would be better served as a functional application rather than a declarative one. Or maybe I'm not so good at C#, but I'm brilliant at F# and I don't really need to do it in a functional manner.
I would say that, as you said, the tools in your tool belt. And I don't know that, especially with web development, I don't know that there's a scenario where a lot of people say this, I'll use it when the problem comes up that it solves. But it's like you're building a line of business applications, so it solves that problem. It's a general purpose language like C# is. So I don't know that there's sort of a case for it here and a case for that there. I will say more broadly speaking, sometimes it's nice just to have to follow the mainstream, right? The trodden path, because if you're using C# and MVC, you're going to have so much more resources out there immediately. There's something to be said about copy paste from Stack Overflow. Whereas, you may find less examples in F#, for example, although they're out there. And I'm pretty fluent in both, so it's easy for me to translate between those two things. But some people prefer the trodden path. Another sort of case around that, particularly with the frameworks, is that with MVC, and this is inherent to kind of the way that they're architected, MVC, because it's convention based, it's easy for them to be able to generate Swagger, for example. And so, you've got Swashbuckle and you've got NSwag that you can plug in, and they will generate you either build time or runtime Swagger, or open API, I should say, spec files, so that you can, generate clients on the other side in whatever language you want. Whereas in Giraffe, that is one thing that's missing at the moment, is there isn't something you can just plug into it and say, give me the Swagger for this thing I built. Because of the architecture of it, it's not convention based. There's no kind of way of introspecting that the code you've built to say, and what is this? What does it map to in terms of roots and sort of types, your inputs and outputs? And that is something being looked at. What we do in the team I'm working in is we go with a contract first approach. So we start by defining our APIs in Swagger. We then build our Giraffe APIs to that definition. And there is actually, if you look at the Swagger Gen repo, there's actually a template for Giraffe. So you can actually generate your server straight from the Swagger. We don't do that, but you can do it. And then we generate a client off of the Swagger file, and we use that to end-to-end test the application we built. And if it pops for any reason, we know that we haven't adhered to that Swagger. So we kind of use that contract. We kind of go contract first, and we treat it as the source of truth for how the API is designed. And you can also, it doesn't have to be an end-to-end test to take advantage of that. You can have it so that you generate that, and you use test server, and you use your type client, and you inject your HTTP client from your test server. So everything's all in memory, if you know what I'm talking about there. Mm-hmm. You can kind of have it so that you're kind of proving that everything is lining up, but with a completely in-memory test, and you're completely functionally testing your application. So that's a really nice pattern.
Oh, I like that. Maybe that's another thing for me to try out, that contract-based API.
Yeah, but we have found it in places to be painful, and sometimes I wish that we make a change to the code and the Swagger comes off the back of it. But it does require a bit more discipline and rigor to go contract first, because it's too easy in MVC application just to tweak the signature of something, and suddenly the Swagger is now different. But maybe nobody really noticed. You have to have measures in place, or thorough code reviews to make sure that you're not accidentally breaking changes.
I see. And again, that's where your unit tests based on that contract would sort of step in and say, actually, you've submitted a pull request which breaks the contract, because you already have this suite of tests based on an older version of the contract. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you just get, it would just blow up with some serialization error, or, how any consumer of your API would experience it.
Okay. It's a lot better than some of the unit tests I've seen for some MVC stuff. Like you say, it's because it's so easy to just change it, and then nobody knows until they run the front end. Oh, wait, your method is broken because you were accepting an int and now you're accepting, I don't know, a GUID or something.
Yeah, it happens a lot.
So where are the best places to go, in your opinion? Where are the best places to go to learn a little bit more about Giraffe and the safe stack and things like that, the sort of things we've covered today?
Giraffe is, you can find it on GitHub under giraffe-f#/giraffe. So there's an org there with a bunch of other sort of related plugins to it and different view engines and all sorts in there. But yeah, the Giraffe project's there. And it has a really good documentation markdown file. So it has one big file with all the documentation in, which sounds odd, but it's actually really, really good. It's really concise, well written. And if you just want to kind of get a flavor of what Giraffe is and what it can do for you, if you just read that and scan through the bits, that are, into the detail, but the first opening few sections, and that really kind of give you an idea about what it's all about. SafeStack, there is a website for that, which is safe-stack.github.io. And if you just Google it, SafeStack, you'll find it.
Okay, excellent. So what about yourself then? Where could people go to find out a little bit more about you? Is Twitter a thing? I don't know, is Gitter? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm on a few things, but if you go to stu.dev, all my various links, for example, Twitter, they're all on there. So you can find me there.
Okay, fantastic. So if there are open source projects, there's a GitHub link and, people can contact you on Twitter. And
yeah, I don't do as much as I should in the open source space. So I always feel a bit guilty, but yeah, I'm I've got a couple of kids, so they keep me busy, and it's hard to find the spare time.
Oh, definitely. I was just saying to a couple of my friends, James Studdart, who runs the Cynical Developer podcast, and Paul Seal, who runs codeshare.co.uk. I was saying to them earlier on today that they are building some wonderful side projects, and I'm sitting here going, I have 17 hours of audio to get through before I can do anything fun with C#. But, I do it for the love,
You're doing a great job.
Oh, thank you very much. So I completely understand how, there's not much time in life, I guess, to do as much open source development as, we may feel like we need to or we should do, because it's all about the amount of time that you have that you can spare for your passion projects. That's always the way I've seen it. If I have 10 minutes to go and learn Hugo, I'll happily spend that 10 minutes going and learning Hugo. I may not build anything, but I may just end up reading through documentation, or I might build something with Blazor and just throw that out there for people to look at and go, this is how Blazor worked back in 0.3, or this is how this works, or this is how that works,
Yeah.
I think there's less to worry about contributing to the community, especially for you, because you're running these events, the DDD Southwest and all of these different places that you're sort of helping to run and organize and get people together with. So don't ever feel bad about not being able to do any kind of open source work.
Yeah.
So speaking of those, just real quick before we end then, where could people go to find out about the events that you put on then? Like I said, it was DDD Southwest, wasn't it?
Yeah, DDD Southwest, and that's dddsouthwest.com. And there's F#, Bristol, and .NET Southwest, which are on meetup.com.
Excellent. So just to confirm then, the DDD events aren't domain-driven design, are they? They're developer, right?
Yeah, which causes a lot of confusion. I feel like I should qualify that every time I say it. But unfortunately, that is a loaded term now. Yeah, developers, which... there is like a DDD conf Europe, like DDD Europe conf or something that I always think, wow, they've done a Europe one now. And then I'm like, oh no, wait, that's the actual domain-driven design thing.
Yeah, that's the problem with acronyms. There's too many of them. We need to have fewer of them, which means we'll end up with more of them, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you ever so much for being on the podcast, Stuart. I've learned a lot today about F# and Giraffe, and like I said earlier on, about being able to understand what the MVU architecture is and what Elmish meant, because people kept saying to me, yeah, it's Elmish, and I'm like, well, what's Elm? And they'd go speak to that person.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. I appreciate what you do.
Thank you ever so much. Like I say, it's hard to spend time just talking to someone for an hour about something that you're passionate about, especially when you say you've got some little ones running around, and so I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to me.
No worries. No, thanks very much.
That was my interview with Stuart Lang. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links for some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.